Hey guys, hope you're doing well. It's kind of a dreary day here and I thought it would be a good day to do a little terrarium work. So as you can see, this terrarium that I have here is quite neglected. This is what happens to your terrariums if you don't open them or do any maintenance on them for, a few weeks. Well, probably longer than that. So I was thinking today I was going to take this terrarium apart and remake it and show you the process of how I do that and just talk about a little bit of a tutorial of what you can think about when you're building a terrarium. Obviously, terrariums come in all shapes and sizes, and they don't have to be expensive. So I kind of want to show you how to make a terrarium work, no matter what you kind of have available to you. So I'm just gonna go and take this guy, take all the plants out. I will save the plants that are still good, but I'm just gonna give it a nice wash and get rid of all the old substrate. Okay, so now I have a nice clean terrarium. It's really important to give whatever vessel you're working with a good clean before you start. It's going to be a lot harder once you have a lot of plants in it. If you're using like a thrifted vessel or an old container, you can use some sort of glue gun to get the label off if that's a problem. And then I use just soap and water. A bit of glass cleaner can help get kind of the shine and any residue off the glass. For this one, it does have some metal on the bottom, so it did get kind of rust stained, and I used like a magic eraser to get some of that staining off. I'm not too worried about it because it's at the bottom. Generally, you do want to avoid containers that have metal because they will tend to rust over time. This one, it just kind of has it as a cap on the bottom, so it stands flat, but there does, water does get in there sometimes, and that's where the rust is coming from. But you can use any sort of glass vessel. Just keep in mind, I find that taller is usually better as plants grow upward. They're usually looking for vertical space. If you have a smaller terrarium, you're going to want to stick to plants that are creeping or terrestrial, not plants that are going to grow upwards. So most ferns and that kind of thing are going to want to grow up very quickly. So just keep that in mind. I usually think that bigger is better because it gives you more room for substrate as well if you have a taller vessel. But again, you can get away with using less substrate. It works best if you have something with I like something that still has a top that you can like fit your hand into, because it just makes cleaning and everything so much easier. So I prefer something with like a larger opening that you can put a lid on, especially if you want to keep really high humidity species. If you're okay keeping less high humidity species, say you want to do jewel orchids or something, you can get something that isn't closed. So something that has a wide top but no lid. That will work well for species that like a little bit lower humidity. If you are going for more high humidity species, then you want something that either has a lid or that has a very narrow opening at the top so that not too much moisture is going to be escaping through the top. It is, I think, the ideal thing would be to have something with a small opening at the top so you do get a bit of airflow, and that can help with mold. Your other option might be to just crack the lid, or of course just take the lid off once in a while. I tend to prefer fully closed terrariums just because they are a bit easier. They don't need to be watered very often. So I find that for me is the easiest, but you might run into a bit more issues with mold and rot if you're working with a closed terrarium. So when you're picking your vessel, that's just a couple things to keep in mind. I also find that a larger environment is a bit easier to maintain versus a smaller environment. So for this one, I have some leca here. I'm going to add a drainage layer. So the thing about a drainage layer, there was some debate, I think, where people were worrying that if you add a drainage layer, you are moving the perched water table up. So essentially, your substrate that sits above the reservoir is actually going to be more wet than it would be if you didn't have the drainage layer. So I did a couple experiments and I found that whether you have a drainage layer or you had it all substrate, the same height, it was basically the same level of moisture with or without the drainage layer. So I think that it doesn't really matter. The main reason why we want a drainage layer is so that the water, the excess water, has some place to go where the roots are not. So a drainage layer mainly helps you if, one, you have the space for it, where you can separate the layers with some mesh or some sort of interface so that the roots aren't going into the drainage layer. Once you have the roots growing into that reservoir at the bottom, it's kind of not really serving its purpose anymore. And roots do tend to grow into the reservoir eventually. So it's kind of debatable, the utility of a drainage layer. It's kind of just a safety reassurance in case you do overwater your terrarium, that you're not going to have a muddy, sludgy layer at the bottom that's displacing the oxygen that the roots need. The drainage layer just, like I said, it gives somewhere for that water to go so that the roots aren't sitting in that water. But if you have a very small terrarium, then as long as you're using a very light and airy mix for your terrarium soil, you actually don't need to worry about a drainage layer. Space is often a big concern with a terrarium, and it would be better to have more substrate, of just a light and airy substrate, than to try and fill it up with a drainage layer, because the roots are probably just going to grow in and it's not going to really help you anyways. You might as well just mix that drainage right in with the substrate. So I'm using leca. You can also use gravel. It doesn't really matter what you're using for the drainage layer because we don't want our roots to get in there anyways. So I'm going to do maybe just 1 or 2 inches of drainage layer. I have a fairly tall vessel. I think I'm aiming to fill it up with substrate about here, I think. When we're thinking about proportions with a terrarium, I try and go with like the 2/3 rule. It'll look the best if you have your substrate not like right in the middle, but if you have it either 2/3 from, or sorry, 1/3 from the bottom, or 2/3, but probably not 2/3 because we want to give our plants some room to grow, right? So I want to aim to keep the substrate around there. So 1 or 2 inches of leca, doesn't have to be a lot. So let's fill that up. Okay, I think that's good. Again, doesn't have to be a lot, just somewhere for the excess water to go. Normally for like an interface layer, it's just a mesh material that you can get at the hardware store that you would use to repair like a screen door, a patio door. That's what I usually use. I don't have any of that at the moment, so I'm going to try using some cocoa coir. This probably isn't ideal because it will break down over time, but it's all I have, so we're gonna try it. So you just want to kind of cut a piece that fits around. It does not have to be perfect. And again, the purpose of this layer is just to prevent the roots or discourage the roots from growing into the substrate at the bottom. Okay, I think that's pretty good. It's going to also prevent our main terrarium substrate and the drainage layer from mixing. Just doesn't want to sit flat, but it'll sit flat once we put some substrate on top of it. Okay, so let's talk about substrate. We want our substrate, regardless of whether we have a drainage layer or not, to be nice and light and airy and oxygenated. The roots in our terrarium are going to need to breathe, and especially in a closed terrarium environment, it can be very easy for the soil to compact and create an anaerobic environment where the roots are going to rot. You have high humidity, the chances of rot are that much higher. Everything's constantly moist. It can be a very bad situation very quickly if we don't add enough of these non-compacting components to begin with. So some really good ingredients to use that are going to prevent compaction in the substrate are things that still retain some water, but they're not going to compact. So things like lava rock that are porous, that's a really good one. Akadama is a clay that's often used in bonsai, and again, it's very porous, but yet it will not break down the way that normal soil would. You could use perlite, but considering we're going to be seeing our substrate, perlite ends up looking really unnatural, so I don't recommend using that in terrariums at all. Pumice is another option. Calcinated clay is another option. Those are all things that are going to soak up moisture but still maintain air pockets, which is what we want for our roots. Those are going to be our main components to the mix. Now, you can use a very fine orchid bark or fir bark as well. It has, again, some moisture retaining properties while still preventing compaction, but you do want to make sure you are using small pieces. The plants that we're going to be planting in our terrarium generally have very fine, delicate roots, so they don't appreciate a chunky mix like we would use for aerides. They prefer more of a fine mix where the water is very easily accessible to their roots and it's not very hard for them to get through. So you can use one or more of those components. For me, I have a bit of extra of a Hoya mix that has, I think it's zeolite, lava rock, and some tiny orchid bark pieces. It's called Jeffrey's Hoya mix, and I will leave a link for it. I have kind of switched to using a different mix for my Hoyas, so I have some extra of that, but it is the same idea. It doesn't retain too much water. It retains some while still preventing compaction. So that is going to be the bulk of our mix. The secondary components, we do want some purely moisture retaining component in our soil, considering a lot of the plants we're going to be planting are very moisture loving. So that is cocoa coir or peat you can use. And then the third component would be a fertilizer. Now this is optional. You could substitute it for one of the moisture retaining components like cocoa coir, but it is good to have some fertilizer in your terrarium unless you're planting carnivorous plants. That's the only exception where you don't want to have nutrients in the soil. So you would want to stick to something like cocoa coir or sphagnum moss that is mostly nutrient devoid. A good option for a terrarium that's also going to help create a natural ecosystem is worm casting. So the recipe for terrarium soil that I've seen is 2 parts of the non-compacting aeration component, 1 part of the water retaining component, and 1 part worm casting. If you don't want to do worm castings, then it would be equal parts of the aeration component to the moisture retaining component. So I'm just gonna go and get my ingredients and I'm going to mix up a bit right now. All right, so for this mix, I'm going to make it with 1 part akadama, which is a porous type of clay. I'm also going to add 1 part of this Hoya mix. So this is charcoal, orchid bark, zeolite, and lava rock, I believe. So this is going to be the aeration component to our mix. Now to this, I'm gonna add 1 part worm castings. Okay, now finally I'm going to add 1 part cocoa coir to be our main moisture retaining component. You do want to make sure when you're working with cocoa coir that you wet it before you're working with it if you're using a big brick, because it will expand a lot and that'll kind of throw off your ratios. Let's just put that down, give this a mix. Okay, and so that's kind of what the mix ends up looking like when we're done. We have lots of little pieces to break up the cocoa coir that can easily get compacted if you were to just use cocoa coir or something similar like moss or peat. Okay, so let's go and add this to the terrarium. If you have a very small terrarium, you can use a funnel, but I'm just going to use a scoop, and I'm going to try and tip the terrarium on its side a little bit, I think, just to avoid getting as much on the glass as possible. It also helps with that if you start with a dry mix and the walls of the terrarium are dry, then they'll just kind of fall down and they won't get stuck to the sides. If it's wet, it'll have a more tendency to kind of like get stuck and get where you don't want it. Oh, I guess that causes my other layer to go. kind of tapping the terrarium is going to help to get it to settle and be even. Okay, I think that's enough substrate. It's good to have about at least 2 or 3 inches, if you can, of substrate. That's going to give the plants room to grow, right? I could actually fill this up a little bit more, but I'm also going to put like a layer of moss on top, so that'll be an additional inch maybe of substrate that the plants will get to grow in. So I'm not too worried about that. I think that's pretty good. 2 or 3 inches will give them at least some room to grow. If you can go even deeper than that, great, but often we are limited with space when we're working with terrariums. I am going to give this a little bit of water right now, I think, just so you can kind of see without the plants in it how the substrate reacts to the water that we're giving it. So give me 1 second. So did you see how when we added the water, it all just kind of soaked in nice and evenly? We don't really have a lot of dry spots. The moisture will get distributed evenly. And you might have noticed when I added more water that we saw excess draining into the drainage layer. So that is what we want to see. And if I go and feel this, yeah, it's pretty wet, pretty moist. I did just water it, but yeah, it doesn't feel soupy. It still feels like it's nice and light and fluffy and something that our plants are going to want to grow into. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a layer of living moss. So that will give us some extra moisture retention at the top, and it'll especially help cuttings as they're rooting to get a little bit of extra moisture. And then as their roots kind of travel down, they'll hit this next layer where the main bulk of the nutrients are. It has a little bit more aeration, so that deeper section that has a bit more tendency to compact should be a nice growing space as well. All right, so let's go get some moss. This is always my most favorite part. Okay, so there are 3 main types of moss that I am using that are generally pretty easy to get. So the main one is actually, I think sometimes it's called frog moss. I'll try and find the actual Latin name. This one is, you can actually buy this in dried form for terrariums. You'll find it at reptile supply places, and it's called frog moss. I'll try and put a picture of that. Now, when you get it, it is dry, but if you add water and you keep it in a high humidity environment, it will actually come back to life. So that's one of the easiest ways to get moss, and it can stand a fair bit of drying out without dying, and obviously it can be rejuvenated. So that is one that you can usually get your hands on in pretty big quantities. Reptile expos are another good place to get, not just this kind of moss, but other kinds as well. But I find this one to be pretty economical. So that's a good option if you can't find anything else. You can usually buy the dehydrated form and you can bring it back to life. Another kind that's really popular and really common is called bun moss. So this I actually foraged myself from a forest, but it's pretty common. It makes a very good terrarium species. And yeah, it can handle drying out as well, but I find it does best in a closed environment. You're going to have a harder time growing mosses in an open terrarium. That's something I've really noticed, is that they do best in near 100% humidity. And why that is because mosses, they don't actually have roots. They get their water through these like leaf tips, right? So the same portions that are photosynthesizing are also taking in the water directly. I forget what the technical name of it is. So it's very, very important that they stay moist all the time and that they're in a moist environment. They don't have roots like normal plants do. You'll also notice, so the way that moss grows, because it doesn't have roots, the bottom parts kind of like die off, and then the moss grows like up and up. And then the tips are alive, but the stuff underneath is is dead. Now it will come back to life if you trim off the top, but the portion underneath that isn't actively photosynthesizing is still playing a role because it's wicking up the moisture that is in the ground and it's bringing it to the surface. So when we place a layer of moss on our terrarium, we're putting a nice interface where if we have any cuttings that are growing on top of the moss, they'll also help to wick up that moisture for the roots. So that's why moss is such a good rooting medium, whether it's dried like the dried sphagnum moss that you buy, but live moss has the same principle. And I actually do have a little bit of live sphagnum moss as well. I also foraged this when I was camping in Northern Ontario. I just took a little bit and I've been able to keep it alive ever since. It does grow natively here in Canada. People have also brought dried sphagnum moss, New Zealand sphagnum moss, back to life. It is a little bit of work. I haven't had as much success with that, but sphagnum moss does grow really well, again, in a very high humidity environment. So those are the three main types that I'm using. I don't think I have enough to fully cover the base right now, but I will do the best I can. It will grow in. All right, so let's talk about good terrarium plants and what makes a good terrarium plant. Obviously, as you can see, this is not a lot of space for plants to grow. This is going to be one of our main concerns when choosing plants. We want something that doesn't have a super aggressive root system. Obviously, this is a pretty tall terrarium, but we also don't want plants that are just going to skyrocket. This is a problem that I often have with ferns, actually. Even though they generally do well in terrariums, they tend to grow tall very quickly. Something like a maidenhair fern, for example, would probably outgrow this very quickly, even if you started with a small one. Although I am really tempted to put a maidenhair fern in here because it would be really cute. Maybe I should try a maidenhair fern in here because anything like that likes a lot of moisture, likes to be constantly wet, does make for a good terrarium species. But I try and go for ferns and plants that stay somewhat petite. So there's a lemon button fern. That's a really good one that stays relatively small. It doesn't get a lot of height to it very quickly. I have a kind of sad looking fern here that's just been growing in my prop box. This one has seen better days, but this is a blue oil fern. This one is a very, very slow grower. Now, this one could probably survive in just a normal household environment, but I find that it does like a lot of humidity to get a nice blue color. I actually had it in this terrarium before and it was doing really, really well. So I kind of want to move it back in here. This little guy, this is a Solanaria species, something like that. There's a few different species of these and basically they all make really, really good terrarium plants. This one has kind of just been living in my prop box with no home, so I think I'm gonna put him in here. The white spots I find really beautiful and I like the contrast of colors and textures in a terrarium. Obviously you choose whatever plants make you happy. What also tends to be really good for terrariums are peperomia species. So this is a little peperomia. I do not know what the species name is off the top of my head, but this is a really, really good one that's often used in terrarium. Now peperomias, for example, string of turtles is Peperomia prostrata. That's another really, really good terrarium species. You'd think that they're a little too succulent to be in a terrarium, but they actually, pretty much all peperomias that I've encountered, actually really, really, really like the humidity. So I highly recommend using something like string of turtles. They make excellent terrarium plants. They also have you can kind of see that this one is like kind of growing this way. It's kind of shooting out roots horizontally. They tend to make really good ground cover. They cover the surface, but they don't have super deep root. And that applies to string of turtles too. They root really, really easily. So any peperomia that you find that has really nice small leaves. There's another silver one that's really good as well. All of those make excellent terrarium plants. And they work whether you have a closed terrarium like I'm making, or you wanted to keep the lid open and have a slightly lower humidity in here. So those ones are really good. More good species. So this is Ficus Plumelia quercifolia. It's the oak leaf ficus. Now this one is excellent creeping species. It's very good to say you don't have moss, but you still want like a green ground cover. This one will vine. It will end up, the only thing you have to be careful is that if the glass is wet, it will end up climbing up the sides. It does like to grow vertically, but if you have a vivarium or something that has like a back wall that you need to cover, this is excellent for covering. It's a wonderful little vine, grows really well, and the leaves are just so adorable. If you can't find this one exactly, you can usually find other creeping ficus in garden centers. The leaves are maybe a little bit bigger, but they still work really well. They work just the same, and you can take just a little clipping and start it that way. You don't have to use fancy terrarium species. There's a lot you can find just in garden centers that work perfectly. I usually like to check out the little 2-inch foliage section. You can usually find really cool plants. One of those is this little guy. I think it's sometimes called a satin vine. I'm not 100% sure what the Latin name is. I always forget this one. But this is one of my absolute favorite terrarium plants because it is, well, first of all, it does amazingly in a closed environment. I've had terrariums that I've just left for like over a year basically without doing any maintenance, and a lot of the other plants rotted, but these guys didn't. They just, you know, kept going. But because they're more succulent and they do have some water retention abilities, they actually do okay even if you were to have the top open. So even in a lower humidity kind of terrarium, they also do really well. So definitely recommend these guys. And I think there's another version. There's not just this one. And they also root really well. Now here I have some in this kind of, this is what I pulled out of the terrarium earlier. This is a Selaginella erythrophyllum, something like that. It's got erythro in there somewhere because it has these beautiful red backs. Selaginella in general are just wonderful for adding color to a terrarium. They love the high humidity. They root really well. They can have a beautiful kind of cascading effect if you have, say, like a higher area in your terrarium going to a lower area. They creep and they make really nice ground cover. That's something that makes them really amazing terrarium plants. Selaginella uncinata is one with blue, iridescent blue foliage, and both of these are just my favorite. And as you can see, it was kind of like completely taking over this terrarium before. So I'm not 100% sure if I'll actually put this one back in here because it was going kind of crazy, like climbing on the walls and stuff, but I might stick it in my vivarium because it's a really nice one. And again, it's good for adding like more color, right? We want a little bit of, you know, different colors and textures in there. This is another one I had in there. Okay, it's looking kind of sad right now. This is marsh pennywort. This is like a marshy plant that lives in really like wet environments. So again, it does excellent in a terrarium. The only thing you have to be careful of is it can take over really quickly. It spreads by these runners. I actually have a really good example in my vivarium where I put some in, and now you can see the line of where it's like traveling along and sprouting. So these are great. Probably don't put them in like a small terrarium because they will kind of take over, and they're very difficult to take out later without kind of ripping up the whole terrarium. So these are good. They're cheap. They're easy to find. But yeah, just be careful. I did have this fern in there before, though. This is just a very tiny rabbit's foot fern. I think these guys can get big, but they have really nice, delicate, intricate foliage, and I don't think they get super tall. So that's another good fern option. If you want to have, I feel like that would be really cute in there actually. You just couldn't see it before because it was all covered up with stuff. And it's called rabbit's foot because it gets these rhizomes that are all hairy, and you can actually, you probably can't see that, but it's actually got another little fern sprouting in there. That's another thing you have to be careful with ferns is sometimes they, like this one, they end up spreading themselves And if you're not prepared for that, they can like kind of take over. But I feel like that one would actually add some really nice texture. So maybe I'll put him back. Okay, now finally, I'm not 100% sure if I'm gonna actually put these guys in, but I have some jewel orchids that have just been living in my prop box. Now, jewel orchids, I do struggle with a bit. They actually don't seem to thrive in like 100% humidity, and they really don't like their leaves getting wet, I find. The nice thing about jewel orchids is that they grow slowly, so if you are making a terrarium, they probably won't fill it up. Jewel orchids are a really good option if you have something with an open top. So if you're looking for species that do well in like an open terrarium versus a closed terrarium, jewel orchid is probably going to be better in an open terrarium versus a closed one. If they do get moisture in their crown, they tend to get crown rot very easily. That's something that I've noticed. I do struggle with them in my vivarium that is more of like a wet all the time kind of environment. I don't think I'm gonna put this one in, but I do have a little begonia clipping as well. Actually, maybe, I'm not sure. Maybe if I feel like I need some black in there. But begonias, now most of them do make really good terrarium plants. The only thing you have to be careful of is some of the more sensitive species need a lot of airflow. So they probably would do better in something that's not permanently closed. They'd probably do better in something that has a small opening. So I would kind of recommend that. Begonias also can grow big. The cane begonias, I wouldn't really recommend putting them in terrariums because they grow big very quickly. But yeah, some of the more sensitive rhizomatous begonias, like I have a Soli mutata in my vivarium. That one really, really likes terrarium life. So if you have a spot where it will fit, then begonias tend to prefer the high humidity. They just don't like getting moisture on their leaves. Many of them. Some of them are not as sensitive, but some of the really, really sensitive ones, like if they grow and they touch the side of the glass where the water tends to condense, the leaves will end up rotting. That happens to like pretty much all plants. You want to avoid having them touch the glass or the leaves will rot, but especially with begonias, it seems to be a big problem. I really, really struggle with begonias, but they propagate easily and they tend to like high humidity as like a very broad statement. And you can find a lot of begonias pretty cheaply at garden centers. Again, you just want to look for ones that maybe aren't getting too big because they can very easily take over if they start to thrive. Okay, let's plant this up. I'm going to start with the biggest species that I want to kind of take center stage first, and then I'm going to be adding in plants as I feel like it needs it. All right, so that's pretty much it. This terrarium is done. It kind of just needs to grow in now and do its thing. Often they won't look the greatest after you first plant them. You kind of have to give them a little bit where the plants, you know, they'll look better once they start turning towards the light, right? Some of them are kind of leaning over, but you know, they'll straighten out once they get in the light. When it's very fresh, I find it doesn't usually look the best. Now it's just gonna be a matter of like keeping an eye on it, making sure it stays moist, especially in the beginning. I do kind of recommend that if you have plants that are rooting, even if you do have a uncovered terrarium, that you maybe cover it just in the beginning so that the plants can root. I don't think I mentioned this before, but it's usually better to use cuttings versus plants that already have a root system. One, because the root system might be too large for the space that you're trying to plant and it can kind of get in the way of your substrate. And also, if you use cuttings, you're not introducing anything harmful to the environment. So you're not introducing fungus gnat larvae, hopefully. Something like that in a closed environment can be very detrimental. So as much as possible, it's best to use clippings. I used a lot of clippings from either in my prop box or from other terrariums that I've had. And with cuttings, you just kind of want to gently press them into the substrate or the moss layer, and they will do the rest themselves. They'll root themselves pretty quickly, especially some of the species I talked about, like those ficus species. They'll end up rooting themselves really well. You probably saw me using some tools like this while I was building. So these are like aquarium. They're for scaping, aquascaping. These are really, really helpful. I have a bent one as well. These are really, really good, especially if you have something with a narrow top. Using tweezers is the key. You can also use them to kind of like press down the soil if it starts to get lifted up as you're like putting some plants in. It's a bit of a puzzle when you're putting it together. You can also get scissors with the same kind of long handle that are designed for aquarium use, but people also use them for terrariums. So when you need to do maintenance on your terrarium, because the plants in here can grow quite quickly, if they're happy, this high humidity environment, right, is going to be nice and warm too. If we're putting it somewhere in the sun, you're going to want to be trimming your plants back every once in a while so they don't get crazy and out of control like this terrarium was before. As far as maintenance goes, if you have a closed terrarium, open the lid once in a while, ideally every couple days, at least once a week. You're gonna wanna be checking the moisture levels. If you do have moss in your terrarium, the moss tends to dry out first. So if the moss is looking a little sad and a little dry, that's a good indication that you want to water. I would basically just add enough water that you kind of see the moisture get to the bottom of the substrate and then stop. It's going to kind of keep dripping through and spread itself out over time. So once you kind of see the water hit the bottom of the substrate, so if you have no drainage, that'll be the bottom of the terrarium. And if you do have drainage, that'll be just to the substrate layer, not to the drainage layer. As soon as you see the water hit that point, just stop watering. You don't want to let your terrarium get bone dry anyways. So if you have a closed terrarium, you're not going to need to be watering it very often, like maybe once a month. And when you do water, you're not going to give it the same soak that we did when we first made it. Probably just a mist for the moss kind of on top is really all that it might need. You're just gonna have to judge it by the moisture that you see in the substrate, but that is one nice thing about terrariums, is that you can at least see the moisture levels. One thing that you're probably going to get if you have nutrients in the soil and or in your water is algae buildup. You would have seen that a lot from this terrarium when we started. There's no real way to avoid that. I don't get that in my terrariums with my carnivorous plants because I use distilled water. That doesn't have the nutrients in it that the algae needs to grow, but obviously if there's no nutrients for the algae, then there's also no nutrients for your plant. So if we take a paper towel, now my terrarium ended up being pretty clean. I didn't get too much dirt on the sides, but you can do this even at the end, is just take a moist paper towel and put it in your tweezers and kind of wipe the side down. Or if it's really wet, then a dry paper towel instead. Like if you just take a piece of, something to wipe and use your tweezers like that, that's the best way to get the algae and stuff off of the sides. And you can do that even if you have something with a narrow opening. It's a little bit more difficult, which is again why I prefer something where I can actually stick my hand through. It makes that maintenance a little bit easier, but that is how you do it. And you do kind of want to keep up with that because once the algae starts growing, it can take over very quickly. And it also blocks the light from getting to your plants. So they tend not to do as well when it's all, covered in algae. Another thing I haven't added to this terrarium that was in there before, I actually took out these pieces of wood because they are starting to get some mold on them. Now, If you're going to use hardscape materials like wood, you can do that. This one actually hasn't fared too badly. Like, it's held up pretty good. I think this is a pine or some other type of hardwood, like those resinous trees. I think they tend to stand up to high humidity a little bit better than other woods, but if you do want to add wood or something to your terrarium, I suggest using either cork or I think it's called spider wood, or some other type of wood that you can get from like an aquarium supply, where those pieces of wood are basically designed to be submerged in water, so they're far less likely to rot when you have them in a very, very moist, humid environment. So if you're going to use those kind of wooden materials, getting them from like an aquarium store is a good place. As far as preventing mold goes, so we already took a couple important steps. We haven't added in soil from outside environments from plants that might already have mold spores in them. We've at least limited that as much as we can. It is normal to get kind of a mold bloom after you have a fresh terrarium. The ecosystem needs time to kind of balance itself out. One thing that I haven't actually done yet, you can add these right to the substrate, but adding springtails to your mix helps a lot. So they're just little tiny insects that live in the substrate and they eat decaying plant matter. So they really help if you add them early to keep mold in check. Like I said, we're also going to take the top off every once in a while. That's going to give some fresh air, some airflow. And the other big thing is that we need to give this terrarium a lot of light. So just like any other plants, these plants need light, minimum of 300-foot candles. Probably most of these plants are good between like 300 to 500-foot candles. Most terrarium species don't fall into the high light category, so you can get away with a bit less, but you do need some light, and that will also help to inhibit the mold growth and prevent rot from happening. I just want to show you quickly another kind of style of terrarium that I've made. So this one has just basically moss, bun moss, and sundews, and a couple other carnivorous plants in it. It has some urticularia in there as well. Carnivorous plants, especially sundews, do really, really, really well in a terrarium environment. You just would want to leave out the worm castings and keep it a little bit more on the wet side and use distilled water. In this terrarium, I don't actually have any substrate. It is all moss. In this case, instead of using sphagnum moss, I'm using the bun moss for all of it. The stuff at the bottom just kind of dies or dries out or whatever. And then at the top is where you actually get the photosynthesis. So basically I keep the bottom wet, and then it just kind of wicks up the water to the tips where it needs it, and also to the roots of the carnivorous plants. So that's kind of another way that you can make a terrarium. So I find that pings don't appreciate the very high humidity. They might do better in an open terrarium. I do find it difficult to find moss that likes to grow in that environment in the open terrarium. I know that there are some that will, especially if it's kept wet all the time, but I personally haven't found, at least commercially available, that I can buy species that do that as well. I really hope that these tips for terrarium making have been helpful for you. I feel like it's the easiest to kind of see someone build it and see the process. It's really not that complicated. Feel free to ask questions and let me know how it goes. I'd love to see any terrariums that you make, because I think they're super cool when everything works out and you have, you know, a little ecosystem that just takes care of itself. To me, that's the coolest thing. Enjoy your day, and I will see you later.